All right, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell. This is News and Views from the Nefarium on Thursday, November 19th, 2015. The year has just flashed by this year, hasn't it? And the Nefarium, as you might guess, has been busy, especially in the wake of the tragic and unfortunate attacks in Paris last Friday. I want to talk about two different things, both of which concern Russia, but one concerns Siberia and the other concerns Syria. And these things are beginning to cause a lot of attention and comment on all of you's part who send me articles. So we'll get to those, but I want to start off with Siberia because there's been interesting corroboration just this past week of my idea that Russia is playing a very, very carefully calculated economic and geopolitical game with respect to the development of its Siberian provinces, all of those provinces and oblasts that are east of the Ural mountain range. This has traditionally been the weak part of Russia. And we know that the Russians have recently passed a bill in the State Duma, basically kind of a Russian equivalent of the Homestead Act, offering land to Russians to go live in Siberia and thereby start to create and build up the infrastructure and population in that part of the Russian Federation. Well, this article comes out uh, now, and the article's titled Japan Interested in Developing Russia's Far East. And this corroborates the thesis that I proposed a few weeks ago that Russia and Japan would start to make common economic cause with the development of Russian Siberia to offset the potential of growing Chinese influence in Siberia with all of those oil and gas pipeline deals between those two nations. Listen carefully. This is by Yuri Maltsev, and this is carried by Reuters. It states Tokyo is planning to create a $110 billion fund to bankroll infrastructure projects in Asia, and part of it could be invested in Russia's Far East, said the Deputy Economic Development Minister Stanislav Voskresensky. The Russian minister has been meeting with Hiroshi Watanabe, the head of the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, or the JBIC, which is, of course, Tokyo's export agency. And we want to note something else in this regard. Russia and the Japanese Credit Bureau recently signed an agreement to allow the Russians access to their financial clearing in the Eastern Pacific. So now this development, let me continue. The head of the JBIC said that Japan is inspired by, I would probably say, is trying to counteract China's New Silk Road and Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, and intends to create a $110 billion fund to invest in Asian infrastructure. He made it very clear that this also concerns Russia and especially its Far East. Any interesting projects are eligible to claim the funds. So it looks to me like what is happening here is Japan is trying to position this new bank and its potential deals with Russia, particularly vis-a-vis Siberia and the northern route for Asian, East Asian, and European trade. Because you recall the Chinese route is interested in that southern route and development of the infrastructure and travel, chiefly rail services through Central Asia. And that southern route is offset by Russian plans to beef up the infrastructure in the Arctic Circle, including a trans-Russian Arctic Circle rail line and expansion, of course, of the Trans-Siberian. So Japan, it looks to me, is positioning itself in line with those Russian agendas to offset any potential growing Chinese influence. Now, this is going to be, I think, a friendly competition. I don't think it's going to be anything in terms of outright hostility between those three Asian powers. But this is one to watch. I think it's a bit of corroboration of the idea that Russia's playing a very fine, very finessed geopolitical game in the Far East. Now, with that in mind, let's turn to Syria, because I received a number of articles from all of you regarding now the apparent change in attitude, at least of the Obama administration. Now, we can't say of the United States, because I think there's been some tremendous infighting between the Obama administration and those entrenched power interests in the Pentagon and the State Department in particular, but also within the intelligence agencies. So I think the Obama administration here is what we have to concentrate on, and whether or not it will have the ability to actually steer the rest of the American foreign policy bureaucracy in the direction it wants to go remains to be seen. But with respect to Syria now, there's two articles, and there were a couple of people, we'll just call them collectively Mr. W, that proposed a kind of new Syria Islamic oriented Molotov Ribbentrop Pact may be hovering in the background. And I'll show you what I mean after you hear this story. This story is headlined, Russia to the West, drop Assad demands if you want to unite against the Islamic State. And this is Dateline Moscow and is referring to the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov says, quote, on Wednesday, the West had to drop its demands about the political exit of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad if he wanted a genuinely international coalition against the Islamic State militants. Lavrov, who said there was still no agreement about Assad's political fate after international talks in Vienna, said that he had detected a change in the West's position since the Paris attacks and the bombing of a Russian passenger plane. Russia, which views Syria as its closest Middle East ally, has long been at odds with the West over Assad's future, with Moscow saying only the Syrian people should decide if he steps down. Now, at the end of this article, there's a link to another article where the French President Francois Hollande is calling on the world to put aside national interests in order to collectively fight the Islamic State. And Lavrov goes on in response to say this, quote, I hope the change of our Western colleagues, which unfortunately only come about as the result of terrible acts of terror, will spread over to other Western partners. That the stance that the real battle with the Islamic State can only be resolved once the fate of Assad is clear, that this position will put to one side, unquote, said Lavrov. Now, I want to follow this up with another article. This is from Sputnik, from NBC, as a matter of fact, and the headline, it's a very brief article. The headline here is Narrowing Rift, U.S. and Russia Entertain Cooperation in Syria. And listen now, it's not the U.S., but listen to the opening part of this article. In a striking shift, President Barack Obama and Russian President Vladimir Putin are embarking on a tentative path toward closer ties and possible military cooperation as the bitter rift over the Ukraine gives way to common cause against the Islamic State group. After months of accusing Moscow of propping up Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, Obama is changing his tune. He's praising Putin as a constructive partner in the diplomatic effort to resolve Syria's war, unquote. Now, what's going on here? I suspect if you roll the tape back to 2 to 3 years ago, when there were all of these insistent moves coming from various quarters in the United States, State Department, the Pentagon, the intelligence agencies, to go have some sort of war in Syria and Iran, you'll remember, that it was the Obama administration that was bucking this tendency. So I suspect that what we're looking at, in one sense, is some sort of factional infighting going on within this country between the White House and, so to speak, the military-industrial complex, which has been driving all of these covert wars and proxy wars through groups like ISIS, which has now grown to the point that it, just like the American financial backing of people that backed Adolf Hitler, this is now gone and spun out of control. I suspect that what's going on is that there is factional infighting and that President Obama is in a tremendously weakened position vis-a-vis being able to control that group and negotiate with the Russians. And the Russians sense this and are saying you have to drop this business of getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. Now, the key role here is going to be played by the European powers, and particularly by France, which by certain estimations would certainly be the premier military power in Western Europe. Um, I think you're going to see perhaps a gradual loosening of the European powers from the grip of American unipolarism and determinism. I think France could be in a position to negotiate a rapprochement with Russia and a united coalition with Russia vis-a-vis the Islamic State. And in fact, there's already talk within France of dropping the provision of getting rid of Assad, of dropping the economic sanctions against Russia. So this could develop very quickly. Now, what do I mean about a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? I've been on the public blogs on the site and here in these news and views pointing out little things that seem to be indicating that there are certain states within the Islamic world, particularly Saudi Arabia, but to a lesser extent some of the other more radicalized states, that sense that there's some sort of sea change taking place in the West vis-a-vis those more radicalized and less secularized Islamic states. So in other words, by radicalized, I would mean a nation like Saudi Arabia. A lesser, much more secularized state would be an Islamic state like Indonesia. So I think that you have a sense in those countries that something is changing vis-a-vis the West's patience and willingness to tolerate these sorts of radical Islamic activities. And in support of that, I suggested that the recent trips of Saudi Arabia and some of its high-ranking ministers to Russia signal a recognition of this sea change. So I suspect that in the wake of the Paris attacks, something else may have happened. This is something we're going to have to watch very carefully in coming weeks. That what may have happened is that radical Islam of any sort by any state sponsor and the states themselves that are sponsoring it is now on the agenda. It's now on the menu. And say what you will about their economic power and their control of significant amounts of the world's petroleum supplies. This could change militarily overnight if they were faced with a united coalition. So a united coalition may be in the works. It remains to be seen if this is going to happen. I suspect a mini coalition, even if the United States doesn't go along, I suspect a mini coalition may be in the works between Russia and France to get this sorted out. And that will put France in a very interesting position. They will be in the driver's seat to determine whether or not Assad stays on after any elimination of the ISIS problem in Syria. So France is also playing some very, very hard geopolitics here. It's going to be interesting to see if they're able to press the advantage that the Paris attacks have now given them, and if they are going to go in for further and deeper cooperation with the Russians. My guess is that over the long term they're going to do this, and that spells yet another signal defeat for the American policy of unipolarism. So the change of tone in the White House, I think, is a message to the opposing faction within American politics that they've got to change their philosophy and thinking and change it rather quickly. So time's going to tell, folks. This is very, very serious stuff. Two very different areas of the world now to watch over the long term. That's it for this week's News and Views, everybody. God bless, and I'll see you all on the flip side. Bye-bye.